It was an intimate look at what those sons were going through. Diana certainly wouldn't have been proud of both of them as they've carried on her philanthropy and graciousness. William and Harry have been commemorating her life over the past year, rededicating her grave, installing a garden.
The details of Diana's struggle in the operating room have now been unveiled, and it's tragic. There has been plenty of speculation regarding her final moments for so long. Now, decades later, some light is finally shed on the matter. The surgeon in charge has finally opened up about what truly happened inside that Paris tunnel and the operating room where her life slipped away. What did her surgeon witness that the world was never allowed to hear? And why is he choosing to speak now, after decades of silence? Join us as we uncover the truth about what actually happened that night in Paris. Assassins love cameras. For a figure as influential as Diana, Princess of Wales, member of the British royal family and first wife of the then Prince of Wales, Charles III, media attention, especially the relentless paparazzi, was an unavoidable thorn in her side. Yet no one imagined that this constant pressure would one day play a role in her tragic death. A year after her divorce to the prince, this attention was still a daily part of her life. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, the car, which was said to contain Diana and her partner Dodi Fayed, was involved in a car crash that claimed both their lives, including that of the driver. Diana's bodyguard, Trevor Rees-Jones, was the only survivor. Their demise came after their vehicle was aggressively pursued by paparazzi upon leaving the Ritz Hotel in Paris. They were pursued into the Pont de l'Alma tunnel and eventually lost life when their vehicle crashed into the 13th pillar. The unusually aggressive pursuit by paparazzi, coupled with the influence of substances on the driver, all played a devastating role in this incident. This left so much room for speculation on if this death was just an accident or a carefully constructed murder by other shadowy figures. In the moments before her accident, witnesses stated that photographers were relentlessly pursuing Diana's car, riding dangerously close and constantly flashing their cameras into the speeding vehicle, aggressively chasing money shots, and abandoning reason. It was a costly act that put the safety of the princess and her entourage second over media photos. This, as a result, led to overspeeding and the eventual car crash. Although such a devastating tragedy occurred, Diana stayed put and kept on fighting. Her story didn't end there. Princesses do not die in tunnels. With the severity of that crash, most would expect a royal such as the princess to instantly switch to the afterlife. But surprisingly, no. She stayed, leaving both feet on either side of life and death. She fought so she could see another day. Perhaps this show of unwavering was what motivated Dr. Monsef Damar and his team at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris to want to go the extra mile to save her life. Dr. Monsef Damar was working at a relatively young age of 33 as a duty general surgeon at the time of the accident, and was thrust in the heart of the dilemma. That morning at 2 a.m., he was trusted with the responsibility of saving the life of the princess. He was given the task of saving a life which was just hanging on by the embers. He might have entered the emergency room prepared to work on just another patient, but not quite. This was one of the most influential people in the world. As her case was already making rounds in the press, all that was left was if she would survive this or not. The magnitude of this operation had more than quadrupled. The weight of his duty could no longer be quantified due to the sheer importance of the patient who laid before him. For someone nicknamed the People's Princess, in that moment all the eyes, attention, flashing lights and blog posts were absent. All that was left behind the hospital walls was an in critical condition. Woman who laid unconsciously and a doctor assigned to her who knew the weight of what he was about to try and save. Treating the Princess of Wales was no joke. No matter how dire and exposed the situation was, they had to stay calm in order to perfectly dice the situation. Sifting through the ashes. As to all medical procedures, examining the patient is one of the first steps to take so as to make a decision on what was to be done. In cases such as these, it was highly uncommon to receive a patient still hanging on for dear life in that manner. They knew whatever chances they possessed it would be at best slim. The medical team had to ultimately strive to forget the weight which was brought upon them as they worked to understand the full extent of her trauma. As the team began their assessment, they performed X-rays and scans, including various medical procedures, which revealed a shocking and devastating truth that was invisible from the outside. While the world's attention was focused on the dramatic crash, the most lethal injury was hidden deep within her chest. The scans showed severe internal bleeding. The source was a tear in her left pulmonary vein, the vessel responsible for carrying oxygen-rich blood from the lungs directly to the heart. This type of injury is exceptionally difficult to treat and almost always fatal. A rupture at such a critical point, where the vein connects to the heart, leads to massive and rapid blood loss. The team instantly knew the situation was far more dire than anyone could have imagined, even themselves. They were not just dealing with broken bones or external wounds. They were facing a catastrophic internal hemorrhage that was literally fast draining the life out of the Princess of Wales. With the source of the massive internal bleeding identified, the medical team knew they were in a desperate race against time. The only chance to save her life required a high-risk, immediate surgical intervention. Opening up, but not therapy. She was suffering from internal hemorrhage. To curb this, they needed to open her up and fix the ruptured blood vessel which had been damaged due to the accident. Recognizing the absolute gravity of Princess Diana's injuries, Dr. Dachmann made the swift and critical decision to perform an emergency thoracotomy. This was a procedure that was usually used as a last resort on trauma cases in medicine. It involved a large incision to open the entire chest cavity, giving surgeons direct access to the heart and lungs. It was the only chance they had to confront the source of the bleeding head-on. This was necessary as they no longer viewed her as a newly admitted patient, but as a dying one. The team knew that with every passing second, the princess was losing a catastrophic amount of blood. Her blood pressure was plummeting, and her body was beginning to shut down. The operating room was a scene of intense, controlled urgency, characteristic of the emergency rooms where surgery was done. The mission was clear: locate the tear in the pulmonary vein and attempt the near-impossible task of repairing it while manually keeping her heart going. A heart that was actively trying its best to surrender. This procedure is a desperate gamble, reserved only for the most extreme circumstances when a patient is moments from death. For the young Dr. Dahman and his team, the pressure was immense. They were fighting against a ticking clock and an injury so severe that few patients ever survive it. The procedure itself was a task so delicate that any slight mishap could cause a life. The battle for Princess Diana's life had officially begun in the most dramatic way possible, a drama involving massive giftings of disadvantages. In this deep hole, prayers suddenly seemed like the surgeon's best friend. But at this point, it felt like God was against answering. Diana's heartbreak. As the surgical team initiated the high-stake thoracotomy, although slim, they were prepared for the challenge of repairing the torn pulmonary vein. However, once the operation began, the true, devastating extent of the accident's trauma became horrifyingly clear. The team discovered an additional problem: a tear in the pericardium, the tough, protective sac that engulfs and shields the heart itself. This discovery was literally just another confirmation that the force from the crash had caused even more damage than the initial scans had revealed. The surgeons were now fighting a war on two fronts, trying to manage the loss of blood from the vein while also assessing the damage to the heart's protective sac. This was all done whilst also preventing the heart from shutting down. They needed to be alert on all fronts. One slight mishap, and she was a goner. Despite the weight of their situation, the team were urged to stay calm, They were treating one of the most influential and powerful women in the world, even though at that moment she well could only just be regarded as their patient. It was evident that they needed to save her, and that saving wasn't looking possible at all. That saving was looking too out of bounds. They needed to think outside of the box in order to stand a chance at countering these numerous predicaments. A new surgery method? Or perhaps another surgeon? A cry for help? At around 2:30 a.m., a desperate cry for help was issued from the current surgeons operating to Professor Alain Pavy, a cardiothoracic surgeon who had a very hefty reputation in Paris. With almost all hope lost, they needed an extra pair of hands, and most especially a brilliant mind to try and make the most out of this situation. With Princess Diana's heart and lung health depreciating on the operating table, the situation had escalated into the most critical scenario imaginable. The team knew they were facing nearly insurmountable odds. With giving up not on the cards yet, Dr. Daman made a crucial decision. Recognizing the unparalleled complexity of the case and the immense weight of the patient's identity, he knew he had to call for more help. Just 30 minutes after she was brought in, a call was placed to summon another expert, Professor Alain Pavy, one of France's most celebrated and experienced cardiothoracic surgeons, to the hospital. Getting a surgeon of Professor Pavy's stature to come in the middle of the night speaks to the gravity of the situation. His expertise in complex heart surgeries was world-renowned, and his presence was the only remaining hope left for a rapidly deteriorating case. While waiting for him to arrive, Dr. Daman and his team continued their relentless resuscitation efforts, refusing to give up. The arrival of Professor Pavy brought a renewed sense of focus and a glimmer of possibility to the now near-exhausted team. Soon, the young surgeon Daman would be joined by a master of the craft, combining their skills in a final, desperate attempt to defy the odds. It was undoubtedly one of the worst cases in each of their careers so far. With everything rapidly deteriorating, what was really the guarantee that an extra brain was really that important? Racing against time. On foot. With Professor Pavy now in the operating room, the uphill battle for Princess Diana's life entered its most intense stage. The team, under the guidance of the renowned heart surgeon, continued their frantic efforts. The clock was their greatest enemy. Every second that passed felt like an hour. It felt like every second could mark the end of all their efforts so far. The team continued working on the chest cavity in an attempt to stop the erratic bleeding from the hemorrhage. The room was a whirlwind of focused activity, with the surgeons working in perfect, desperate synchrony. As she was drifting, they continued the direct cardiac massage, a physically demanding task that required immense stamina and concentration, all while trying to address the damage to the pulmonary vein. Despite their combined expertise, the damage was simply too deep. The depth of the injury itself had made it in such a way that time wasn't lending a listening ear to their efforts. The tear in the pulmonary vein was in the worst possible location, right at the junction with the heart. It was no simple tear that expertise and hope could simply just solve. The ongoing hemorrhage of the vein meant that even as they manually pumped her heart, her body was still being starved of the oxygenated blood it needed to survive, a reality that was eating away at them with each passing second. How on earth were they meant to handle this? Silent, internal questions passed as they worked tirelessly. For God knows how long, this grueling and desperate battle continued. But nature always prevails. Even the most heroic medical efforts have their limits, and the team soon found themselves falling into another trap. Diana, a princess unlucky with love. Despite the surgeon's relentless efforts during the thoracotomy, they faced another heartbreak. The tear in the pulmonary vein continued to cause a massive, unstoppable hemorrhage into her chest cavity. Her body, already weakened by the immense trauma of the crash, was being starved of life-sustaining blood. At this critical juncture, the medical team's worst fears were realized. Princess Diana's heart, unable to withstand the immense strain and lack of blood flow, stopped beating. She was in full cardiac arrest. Another predicament, one of the worst kinds that could possibly befall them. The fight to save her transformed from a complex surgical process into a desperate struggle to revive her heart. The surgeons immediately began another series of direct cardiac massages. Defibrillator paddles were charged and applied. Even doses were administered, all in a bid to jolt the heart back into a rhythm. The atmosphere in the operating room became incredibly tense. The previous steady beeping of monitors was replaced by the flatline tone of a heart that had ceased to function. Every person in that room, from Dr. Daman to Professor Pavier and the nurses, knew that the odds of bringing someone back from a traumatic cardiac arrest were infinitely small, and with time, it was reaching atomic levels. Yet, driven by their duty and the profound weight of the moment, they refused to give up, initiating a long and grueling battle to revive her. An all-out resort. The final frantic pump of the medics. Once Princess Diana's heart stopped, the operating room turned into a battlefield against death itself. The team, led by Dr. Daman and Professor Pavi, initiated a frantic and prolonged series of normal medical resuscitation efforts. This was not a moment of quiet surrender. It was an hour-long all-out assault on her heart to bring her back. They did this whilst their own hearts raced. They weren't oblivious. It was obvious they were running out of options but just couldn't bring themselves to stop. She was rejecting everything. Still, they continued the direct cardiac massage, a physically demanding procedure that requires a surgeon to manually pump the patient's heart to maintain some semblance of blood flow to the brain and other vital organs. Simultaneously, they administered high-dose injections of adrenaline directly into her heart muscle, a powerful stimulant used to try and shock the cardiac tissue back into action. Even to the pills, she was unresponsive. The defibrillator was used repeatedly, sending powerful electrical currents through her chest in the hope of restoring a natural rhythm. Every known life-saving protocol was deployed. They knew what her loss would mean, not just to her family, but to millions around the world. The surgeons, nurses, and technicians in that room weren't just in a battle for their dignity as professionals or the life of an influential woman. They were fighting against a global heartbreak that felt imminent at that point. This trial and error lasted for an hour. There was nothing left. She wasn't responding positively. A decision had to be made. Acceptance of the vital sign. Monitor. As the clock approached 4 a.m., it was becoming increasingly clear that their efforts were in vain. After nearly an hour of continuous, high-intensity resuscitation efforts, the grim reality that it was simply impossible in the operating room became unmissable. Every medical intervention had been countered with nothing. Every attempt was met with the void, silence. Despite the direct cardiac massage, the repeated defibrillation shocks, and the administration of powerful cardiac stimulants, Princess Diana's heart remained still, beatless. That hardest decision any doctor could make was becoming an unavoidable thing at this point. It was a situation of they tried, but sometimes academia cannot just overcome the level of the injuries. There were no signs of revival. Her body had endured a level of trauma from which recovery was no longer medically possible. The team, physically and emotionally drained, had to face the hardest choice any medical professional can make. At approximately 4 a.m., Dr. Daman and Professor Pavi shared a solemn, silent understanding. There was nothing more they could do. To continue their efforts would be futile. With a heavy heart, they made the final, heartbreaking call. They finally accepted what had been in front of them for the past 2 hours. The decision was made to cease all attempts for resuscitation. In that moment, the frantic energy of the operating room gave way to a sad and heavy-like silence. The fight was over. The doctors, nurses, and technicians stood in shared grief, staring at the immense weight of what had just transpired. They had given everything they had, but it was not enough to overcome the accident's catastrophic effects. It was over. The princess had moved on from the act of breathing. The princess who was speeding in her car just hours ago was no longer. Her 2-hour fight had come to an end. A return to dust on speakers. As it got to 4 a.m., it became increasingly clear that there was nothing that could be done. Heavy silence continued. Was she just fated to die? Or could they actually have done something better? The feeling was daunting. A star, which illuminated the earth, had been forced to go 6 feet under. A woman who had been larger than life was gone. The princess of the people was dead. But still, the final formal duty fell to the medical team, those who treated her till her final moments on the planet. At 4 o'clock in the morning of August 31st, 1997, the doctors officially pronounced Princess Diana dead. The moment was one of sadness and professional defeat for everyone in the room. They had battled for hours against insurmountable odds, fighting with every tool and technique at their disposal, only to be met with stark reality, a reality which they initially did not want to accept. For Dr. Monsef Dahman, this was a moment that would be seared into his memory forever. As a young surgeon, he had been at the center of a historical tragedy, a witness to the final moments of a global icon. The official declaration was more than just a medical procedure. It was the confirmation of a loss that he knew would be felt by millions around the world. The news, which had been confined to the sterile walls of the operating theater, was now something that would have to be shared to the general public. Announcing her death marked the end of a desperate medical battle and the beginning of a global period of mourning. The earlier weight of pressure to save a life now turned to one of sadness and defeat. Apples and onions for doctors. It was no surprise that the medical staff drove their nose mask-covered heads into their glove-covered hands. It was an utter defeat. There was absolutely no opportunity to be optimistic. There was no rainbow in the sky. All was lost. Forgetting the status of their now dead patient, it was never going to sit well. They had just spent hours of normal and abnormal medical procedure trying to save a life, and at the end, all for nothing. They couldn't even get her to regain consciousness even for a bit. The questions they asked themselves were harsh and unfounded, one natural to those who experience grief. They went into grief straight on, and it lasted for a tangible amount of time. Their loss could not just be forgotten by a night out or spending quality time. This one took a toll on their mental health. The knowledge of the pain that would be brought upon the world by their incompetence amplified this feeling of grief. The knowledge that they had the chance to stop a global mourning but couldn't. The emotional toll was compounded by the intense media scrutiny that descended upon the hospital. Every person who had been in that operating room became a figure of public interest, hounded by reporters and conspiracy theorists. They were no longer just doctors and nurses. They were the last people to see Princess Diana alive. This unwanted attention made the grieving process incredibly difficult. For the medical staff, their failure was not just a professional one. It felt deeply personal. They had been on the front lines of a historic tragedy and were left to process the devastation largely on their own. The experience highlighted the immense, often unseen, emotional burden carried by medical professionals who are forced to confront life and death on a daily basis. But this was a case on a scale that none of them had ever imagined. Nothing concerning this death had a positive impact, globally and personally. The lives of most were changed. The surgeon's final word. The pronouncement of Princess Diana's death at 4 o'clock that morning sent immediate and devastating shockwaves around the globe. This outpouring of public grief, however, was quickly followed by a storm of speculation, media frenzy, and conspiracy theories that would rage for years. There was no pity. The media, fans, and masses dropped theories on each of the individuals and situations involved in her death. Right from her trip to Paris to her trip underground, everything became a connection to these conspiracists. It was this intense and often toxic environment that forced Dr. Monsef Dahman and the other medical professionals who were in the operating room that night into a profound, decades-long silence. They retreated from the public eye, refusing to engage with the wild narratives that were being spun. They were doctors who had fought an uphill battle and lost. They had no desire to become any sort of public figures in the circus that followed. For multiple decades, Dr. Dahman carried the immense emotional weight of that night, holding the true, minute-by-minute medical account in silence. He finally decided to break this silence, not to create more headlines, but to extinguish the baseless rumors with the truth. He felt a responsibility to the truth and to the memory of the late Princess Diana. His goal was to provide a clean, first-hand account of the 31st, honoring the professionalism of his team who fought tirelessly against very impossible odds from night till morning. Princess Diana's injuries, especially the tear in her pulmonary vein, were simply unsurvivable, and he needed the public to understand that. His decision to finally speak has offered the world a much more human perspective, shifting the focus away from the years of speculation and toward the real, heartbreaking medical story that happened inside the emergency room, where a dedicated team did everything in its power to save the people's princess. If you were to answer honestly, do you think the death of the princess and her entourage was a planned political move? And do you think the decision to stay silent by the doctor was justifiable? Would you also take a break? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.